popular conception that Darwin more or less invented the theory of evolution. He went to the Galapagos Islands, he traveled around the world, he made all these observations, and he came back and he thought about it for a few decades, and then out of nowhere he came up with this theory. Of course, that couldn't be further from the truth. In fact, a lot of these ideas were floating around a long time before Darwin was born, and what he was doing was creating a synthesis, if you like, a very successful synthesis, but a synthesis of these different ideas into something that obviously worked and did revolutionize what we now call the biological sciences.
And you mentioned that Henry Cheek wrote about his thoughts on evolution, but sadly died. Were there any other people who were writing about evolution with the intention of publishing?
Well, I should have mentioned before that, in fact, Darwin's grandfather, Erasmus Darwin, had also came up with an evolutionary theory back in the late 18th century as well. And this was actually quite a well-known theory. And people in Edinburgh were also aware of that. So it wasn't just these French sources that they were drawing inspiration from. In fact, Darwin's own grandfather was also an evolutionist, and his work was known to people like Robert Grant. I'm telling you, there's actually a very famous person who actually claimed that Darwin had plagiarized him. There was a man called Patrick Matthew who was actually a fruit grower, and he wrote a book about growing timber for naval purposes, I think in the early 1830s, who in the appendix to his book, he actually outlined this theory of evolution by natural selection, but hardly anyone read it because it was in the appendix to a book about naval timber. Darwin almost certainly hadn't come across it, but when Darwin published The Origin of Species, Matthew wrote to him and said, hang on a minute, you've stolen my idea. Look, it's here in my book that I published 30 years ago. Darwin wrote back and said, okay, yeah, it is the same idea, but I didn't know about it because I'd never read your book. And also, it's just like one little footnote, more or less, whereas I've written this whole big book about it. It's almost certain that Darwin didn't steal the idea from Matthew. And also, it's also true that, as we've been saying, differential survival, these changes in the characteristics of populations of animals and plants, was a fairly common idea at the time.
So that's fascinating that the idea that would change the face of scientific discourse was in the appendix of a book about timber.
He just didn't think it was that important. In fact, I think he said to Darwin, he just thought this was sort of common sense, and he didn't think it was a big deal.
When did the ideas in Edinburgh surrounding evolution start to shift towards Darwinism and away from Lamarckism and Joffrey's ideas?
Oh, that would be much later. I mean, Darwin's Origin of Species wasn't published till 1859, so it would certainly be after that. I couldn't actually tell you which Edinburgh professor of natural history was the first one to adopt Darwinian evolution. But in fact, there was a kind of a period as well when things go a bit quiet as well. There's this period when a lot of people are talking about evolution in the 1820s, mid-1820s, really through to the early 1830s. And the interest kind of dies down a bit after that. You don't find so much evidence of it. Possibly because a lot of the key figures who were interested in this kind of stuff have either moved on. Robert Grant goes down to London in 1827, for example. He becomes a professor at the new University College London. Cheek dies. Robert Knox, who I haven't mentioned before, was probably also thinking along evolutionary lines at the time. He certainly did later on. He was another professor at one of these extramural anatomy schools. He was involved in the Burke and Hare case, that he was buying the bodies from them. And so he had other things to think about other than evolution for a bit. And then his career went downhill rather after that. And he ended up moving to London as well later on. So a lot of these people, they just died or moved on. And there didn't seem to be a new generation of evolutionists taking over from them.